friends, and welcome to All by My Shelf. I'm Miss Rachel, and it's so nice to see you. Today's panel is We Are the World Builders. 5 incredible young adult authors will tell you about just what it takes to craft their incredible fantasy worlds. Today's panel is moderated by Sami Thomason, an incredible bookseller from Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi. Today's panelists are Bethany C Morrow, Alex London, Shveta Thakrar, Morgan Rhodes, and Jessica Rubinkowski. If you're a Glenside patron, make sure you click the link in the description below that will take you to the list of books from this panel you're able to check out immediately as ebooks, or you can fill out the form to tell me which books you'd like to place on hold for when the library is finally able to reopen. I hope you enjoy this panel. Have a great day. I'm Sami Thomason. You may know me on Twitter as Sami Says Read. I'm a bookseller at Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi, and we're going to talk about world building. Yay! Yay! Start off, let's have everyone introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about your book, and then we'll get rolling. Whoever wants to go first. I'm in gallery view, so y'all aren't in any order now.
Okay, I'm going to start if nobody... Okay, I didn't interrupt me. All right, so I am Bethany C Morrow. I'm the author of A Song Below Water, which is a contemporary fantasy that comes out June 2nd, 2020. I'm also the author of Mem, which came out in 2018. And I edited an anthology called Take the Mic, Fictional Stories of Everyday Resistance, and that came out in 2019.
I'm Morgan Rhodes. Hi. I'm the author of the Fallen Kingdoms series. Shiny. It's a 6-book finished series, high fantasy with Razor Bill. And yeah, so I wrote that. That was a lot of fun. And I also write under the name Michelle Rowan, if you guys want to check out those books. Those are more vampires and witches, paranormal stuff. Glad to be here.
My name's Jessica Rubinkowski. My debut novel, The Bright and the Pale, will be published in March of 2021, and it's just inspired by Russian folklore. And yeah.
Hi, I'm Shveta Thakrar, and I have a bunch of short stories and essays in various anthologies, and my debut novel, Star Daughter, and it will be out in August of this year.
And I'm Alex London, written 23 novels for readers of all ages, but my newest is an epic fantasy series called Black Wings Beating, and the second book, Red Skies Falling. They're an epic fantasy set in a world of cutthroat falconry about a brother and a sister on a quest to capture the giant killer bird that killed their father, and they're on a quest for love and redemption and giant psychic eagles. And the third book in that series, Gold Wings Rising, will be out September 1st.
Yay! Okay, well, to get started, I'd love for everyone just to start talking about like your world building process. Like, what's the first thing you do when you have an idea about a world? What's your process for building it? And then how that translates into your writing. Alex, do you want to start since you went last time?
Sure. So I generally start, I sort of simultaneously character and concept kind of come to me together in like a vague way. I mean, it's hard to describe because I think of writing a novel, it's like throwing a log onto a fire, you know, and a lot of different sparks fly up and you don't know exactly which ones catch, and probably more than one does, and they don't all. And so a lot of things are kind of flying up when I begin. For Black Wings Beating, it was specifically, it started, I wanted to write a queer epic fantasy. I'd written a sci-fi novel, a dystopian novel in 2012 called Proxy. It came out in 2013, and it was a dystopian action thrillery thing with a gay lead. And at the time, that was fairly revolutionary in a mainstream young adult dystopian novel. You hadn't had a gay hero before, and I got a lot of praise for it, and yay, go me. But when I was looking back at it, I realized that this gay lead was hitting all of the sort of same standard action hero-y tropes, you know, and basically like doing the like cis male patriarchal punch stuff kind of way of winning in an action story. And I didn't want to just write, when I wrote my first fantasy novel, I didn't want to just write queer heroes. I wanted to queer heroism itself, and create a kind of queer heroism. And so in thinking about that, and in thinking about the structure of the story, I read an essay from, I think, the 70s by the writer Joanna Russ, called What Can a Heroine Do? Or Why Women Can't Write. And it was about her battle trying to write feminist fantasy and science fiction in the 70s in a patriarchal structure where even the way that stories are constructed, that we all learn how to build a story, you know, like rising action, exposition, rising action, climax, resolution, that structure is the same structure as the male orgasm. And she realized that her, right? It blew my mind. When I read that.
I never thought about that, but you're totally right.
I was shocked right now. I didn't expect it.
So the way that I had learned to tell stories had this sort of patriarchal structure built into it, and I wanted to think of a different way, and falconry became that structure for me. I was watching a hawk in my yard circle, and it was really exciting. It was clearly hunting something, and I was like, what if I tried to structure my story that way? And so it started just kind of as a structural metaphor, and then the more I learned about falconry and birds of prey and how you train them, I learned that the only way to train a bird of prey is through gentleness and care, and really love. And you can't force them to do anything. You can't coerce a bird of prey. So if I created a fantasy world where birds of prey were revered and the only path to power was through birds of prey, then the only path to power was through gentleness, care, and love. That to me seemed like a good way of queering the whole hero's quest. So it kind of started in this vague, like, I want to write something super gay and birds, woo! And then everything kind of came from there. And from that, the religion of the society and how they do funerals and how they grieve and how they celebrate and all of those things sort of started with birds. And as a white guy writing fantasy, I then had to start thinking to make sure I wasn't importing our worlds, because it's a secondary world fantasy, right? So I didn't want to import our world's constructions of race, gender, sexuality into my fantasy world, which then makes me question every aspect of how that society is organized, and how I use language within it, and even just on the pronoun level, you know, like background, like soldier number 3 needs, what pronouns do I use for soldier number 3? All of those things come there. So it starts with this kind of vague desire, and then I've been talking a lot, but it just, yeah. So yeah, I'm going to stop talking now.
I know, that was wonderful.
That was good.
Yeah, I loved that.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this question a little bit last night, and I remember something that author Kay Elliott had said in her lecture on world building that I was lucky enough to hear at a conference one time. And she was talking about how you need to think of the economics of the world and what drives it, and everything goes from there. And I laughed to myself because I don't do that at all. When I write, one of the things that I want to do is create, because I'm just going to say, I do believe in magic. And so I want to create a world that will allow the reader to feel magic too. So all of my world building is about how to create atmosphere. And I use a lot of imagery. I'm a very visual writer. And I start out with very dreamy ideas that I have to then pull in and revision so that it actually can work as a story, and not be like, oh, how nice would it be if all the stars were lovely people? Well, then you don't have a story. If this, for example, a star daughter, right? Then there's no conflict, there's nothing. So I guess all my world building really is how to create that sense of atmosphere and magic, and draw on mythology. Like I really want to bring Hindu mythology to the fore, since we've already had so much Western stuff, you know, Greek and Roman mythology, but I'm ready to see everything from around the world too. And as a Hindu person, as a Desi person, I can use my mythology. So I'm trying to bring in details that would be really interesting and fun and then make them my own. And I don't really think about the practical stuff that I probably should, sorry, Kate Elliott, unless it feels immediately relevant to me, if that makes sense.
I've also heard Kate Elliott lecture on world building. She is the queen. You definitely should look it up. She's so thorough. That's just a programming note. Jessica, do you want to talk about your world building?
Sure. So basically, I was a psychology major when I was in college, and there's this term in there called scaffolding, and it basically is constantly building on top of something you've already learned. So what I do is I come up with a base, and it's something that the reader should easily understand, but then I hint at something more. And so they'll keep reading and learn more and more and more and build off of it so that they'll finally get the whole picture of the world. Because I've run into a lot of people who are like, oh, I don't like fantasy. It's too much, basically. I don't want to sit there for 700 pages and just learn about this world and everything. So I wanted to kind of make it more accessible. That was my whole the goal going into writing my debut. And so yeah, that's what I kind of start with. And then I also try to make it feel real, like it could be a real place. So I added in like trade routes and where they would have learned certain things. And since it was based off kind of a Slavic folklore, because my husband, who I met at 16, is Polish, and so I've been part of his family since I was 16. And so I kind of wanted to bring in all those wonderful traditions that I've learned through them. And a lot of their stuff, they basically stole from people around them. So I was like, well, I'm just going to write that in there. And basically went off that point that a lot of, especially like Russia, I found out, they just took it from other places and used it there. So I decided to kind of write that into the story because it would feel real. So I try to base it sort of on, I do a lot of research and base it sort of off what I learned from there, and then slowly scaffold it up so that it makes sense and feels like a whole real, fully fleshed out world.
Morgan?
World building, that was a long time ago, but I mean, I'm still doing it now. I'm building a new series right now, so I get to have fun again. With my earlier books as Michelle Rowan, they were really character driven. So I would create the character and then I would build the world around them. But for this, for the Fallen Kingdoms, I wanted to try something different, which is to have the game board. You know, the world is the game board, and after that's all built, then you put the pieces of the game on, and then they interact within the world. So I'm getting some text. I never do, except when I'm doing this. So for me, since I knew it was going to be like a medieval type world, so I had to do my research on medieval and play off of that, and royalty. And I absolutely needed to know from day one what my magic was, because there's Harry Potter magic and Harry Potter magic. I didn't want that, so I decided to go with elemental magic, which was really like the base level of my world building. So I did for book one. I think the question was that came in through email was how much world building do you share with the audience? And I'm like, I share everything, because I had the basics for book one, and then with each additional book, I would build on that as I needed to. I didn't spend like 5 years building my world and then writing. I kind of I wrote, and when I got stuck, I would leave a section or questions to answer for draft two. And I took it from there. And the fun thing is that when you do world building, you make those initial choices for book one, and then maybe book four, you have something that's contrary that comes up. It can't break your own rules. You have to kind of go with your original rules. And if you do break the rules of your world building or your magic system, you need a really good reason. So one of the ways I got around that was that my mythology The start of all my mythology and magic happened 1,000 years before the events of Fallen Kingdom. So most of it was told through books and tales. And, it's like the telephone game where you start at the beginning, and by the time it gets to the end, it's a little different. So I had that actually as an explanation of some things that I wanted to just tweak a little bit, and it worked really well. At least I think it did.
I agree. Bethany?
So I think this is a difficult question for me to answer because of how I don't keep writing the same thing. I mean, and by that I mean like even genre. So I write speculative literary fiction, A Song Below Water, and the follow-up to it will be contemporary fantasy. I write second world science fiction. And I think I have a lot in common with Jessica, but that's probably because I studied sociology and psychology and clinical psych. But so the scaffolding is definitely the way that feels natural to me. I think I probably tip into crypticness though, because I don't like to think for the reader. I don't like to remove the necessity for the reader to think. So I don't like to over explain things in young adult. When I write young adult, I tend to, your editor is like, could you please just deign to explain this one thing, please? Whereas in adult work, it's like, you either figure it out or you don't figure it out. I'm not gonna, hold your hand. But so it's a bit different depending on what I'm writing. So with The Song Below Water, it's contemporary fantasy. It's set in a real world place, just like Mem was, but Mem is also set in the past and sort of an alternate history sort of thing. So I do think that I always start with the concept. Sometimes the concept is the character. So I was DMing with my sister on Twitter, and I said my voice is power because we were talking about how Black women get attacked online, and the people who are attacking you, usually what they're saying is like, nobody cares what you think, you're nothing, blah blah. But it's like, but you're all taking the time to dogpile on me. So, sort of, not matching what you're saying is not matching what you're doing. And so I said to her, my voice is power, and then I was like, oh, okay, so there's a character whose voice is actually power. Oh, okay, so that it's because she's a siren. Oh, only Black girls are sirens in this world. And that became, the point of A Song Below Water. And I said it in Portland, in the real Portland, and I just sort of did what I call like a glimmer of fantasy on top of it in terms of having fantastical creatures. But I very much, a lot of times I would get asked questions about, well, how does this work and how does this work? And in my mind, if I don't explain it, it works the same way it works in your world. If it doesn't work the same way it works in your world, I will tell you that it doesn't work the same way. So when I'm writing contemporary fantasy specifically, it is very much like, it is your world, and then here are the things that are different, and that will slowly through scaffolding become clear. But I'm not changing the basics of what life is like. Like if you're a teenager living in Portland, you're still going to eat at Skyline, maybe, like you're still, it's still Portland, Oregon. Whereas with second world science fiction, of course, I don't. Sometimes it depends, I guess, on the format. If I'm novella or not. There was a story that I never finished, Shveta, because as I was trying to think of the concept, I kept imagining the economy and how it worked, and I was like, that doesn't work for a novella. That's getting way too deep. I'm not interested. I never finished writing that because every time I tried to go with this concept of this society that I was really interested in, all I kept getting was like how their economy works, and it bored the crap out of me. So so typically with second world it is very different because but I think I will still go, I'll have my concept and then I'll have a character, and the first way that I get to know the world is organically how it reacts to the character, what they encounter that is different to what I encounter. And then of course, the very first process, the first couple of scenes is a bit slow going because of that, because you're understanding more and more about the world as I'm moving forward with this person. And then at some point I will stop and now seeing the little pieces, the little germs of the world that I have, will spend time specifically thinking of that. But it will still grow with I sort of do rolling revisions and stuff. By the time I write the end, it's not the first draft. So it's like the 17th draft. So for me, those things sort of, they just keep going and working themselves out sort of in tandem as I'm writing. I don't know if any of that made sense, but it's because, again, it's like, if it depends on what genre I'm writing.
Well, that's the thing, as someone who's written in almost every imaginable genre, I think of it the same way. It happens differently in each genre, but I don't think the process is actually different. I think, all writing is world building, right? Like, you're writing a contemporary realistic novel, you can assume your reader knows a lot more, but you're still picking which details and how much to share and what you can assume they know. And when you're writing, as you get more and more, I call it degrees of strangeness. As you keep adding these degrees of strangeness, there's more you can't assume that your reader will know. And so it's how much are you changing and how can you mess with their assumptions, basically.
Well, the thing for me is when you can do the same thing for second world science fiction. The problem is with contemporary fantasy, I'm saying, I assume you know this, so I'm not going to say anything. Whereas in second world science fiction, if I don't say anything, you're going to treat it, you're just naturally, as a human being, you're just going to insert your reality into it. So my work is constantly keeping the reader from inserting their world onto my second world.
Exactly. That's where it's so much fun, right? You're basically trying to conquer their reality with your reality.
Just constantly overpower their brain so that they stop injecting themselves and their reality onto my world.
And can I quickly piggyback onto what you're saying too, Alex, about how because that just got me thinking that something that those of us from marginalized groups get too, right, Bethany, is, but you need to explain this thing that is completely, normal for you, because I, as outsider, don't get it, so please spell it out. And I refuse to do that. I try to find ways in context to give you what you really need to know. And the rest of it, a good writer can, her job or their job, right, is to make a story that flows. And if the reader still can't figure something out, well, there's always Google.
Well, my thing is that to me speaks specifically to who my target audience is, Shveta, because if I'm saying, like, A Song Below Water is for everyone, but it's two Black girls. So there was a question once that was like, can you define what a sister friend is? And I'm like, absolutely not. Because as soon as I define that, the Black girl reading it is like, oh, you're not talking to me. I know you're not talking to me because I know what that is. So if you're defining it, that means you're talking to somebody else. So of course, as non-white writers, there are decisions that I make in world building that are specific to protecting my target audience and protecting my kids knowing this, I'm talking to you.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And yes, 100%.
Yeah, and I do think we have a responsibility as readers, like, not everything is written for you, and that's okay. You got to read, you got to adapt. You can still enjoy stuff if you're not the target audience, you know? It's not always about you.
Well, I say learn to read, because it is a form of illiteracy. We are very fluent in Western cisgender, white, heteronormative. We're very, very fluent in that, and we have to be. So when somebody says, well, I just couldn't get it, I just didn't, well, that's an area of illiteracy for you, if we just want to call it what it is. So you need to do what we've done and ingest things that do not reflect you, ingest things that do not center you, and your fluency will grow. But it's, expecting everything to immediately be for you is just a horrible symptom of white supremacy, and just assuming that, like, everything is always supposed to cater. That means that everything is for one person. There needs to be something for everyone, not everything for someone. Like,
what I especially feel like, and especially when you're doing like second world fantasy, that whole thing where I don't understand, it doesn't hold up. It's a fantasy world.
Right.
Like, so you're more than willing to accept somebody riding dragons and having telepathic abilities with a dragon, but you can't figure out non-Western, non-white anything. It doesn't make sense to me. I feel like it's an excuse for sure.
Well, of course it is. Of course it is.
Oh, y'all are making me so happy. This is the type of world building panel that, like, I'm here for. Yes. I do want to switch gears a little bit and talk about research, because I know that's a big part of the process.
This is actually pretty hard, because since I'm drawing on Hindu mythology and folklore, which is something that's not known very well here in the West, which is the market I'm mostly writing for, there's this thing that happens a lot when marginalized people are writing using stuff that's not well known, people start to look at their novels, which are fiction, as textbooks. And they assume that whatever we have chosen to change is actually the source material. And that's really frustrating because as writers, we're supposed to be able to play with things just the same way that a cisgender, straight, white person can do with, say, Greek mythology, right? So I try really hard to think about what I want to draw on, which is the research part. And honestly, this is hard for me too, because I don't know all my own stories a lot of the time. I was born and raised here in America. I knew some from what my parents taught me. My dad used to tell me some stories, like from Punch Tantra, which are the oldest fables before Aesop's even. And we had these little books and comics called Amar Chitra Katha, which would take a lot of the epics and legends and things and put them in comic book form for kids. But still, there's so much I don't know about. There's variations I have no idea about, and so even I get nervous that I'm going to do something wrong, if you will. And especially because, again, if I'm the first point, or my work is the first point of contact for a lot of people, I'm nervous. And so, like right now, I can't say much about what I'm working on yet, but it involves a lot of mythology again, and I'm reading and trying to figure out how to incorporate this stuff, because it won't be things that I can just rely on people being familiar with like Snow White, for example. I don't have to explain Snow White to anybody, right? We're all familiar with 19 million versions of that. But for this, it's really hard, and I'm actually curious, Bethany, to see what you have to say about that as well.
You were telling my whole life with your words right now. Literally everything that you just now said, particularly about the way that our work is judged, how we're not able, or people want to keep us from playing with things because they want to take this first introduction, because they're illiterate in this field. They want to take whatever you write as and then judge it as being the standard. So if it is wrong, it's like, well, this is inauthentic. We're not going to talk about the million different ways we've talked about the fall of Troy. We're not going to talk about all the different characterizations of Troilus or whatever. We're just going to allow different writers to play with that. Something specific that I did in A Song Below Water is that I didn't want all of the fantastical creatures to be familiar Western creatures. So there are a loco in the novel, and the thing about a logo is it's also not Western African. We have a lot of Western African folklore and fantasy happening right now, which is amazing. But someone said specifically the telephone effect while we've been talking, and I am Black American. I do not have a nationality from the African continent. I don't have any familiarity with, I'm a mixed race Black American from the West Coast, so I am extremely divorced from anything else. I decided I wanted to introduce something as a diaspora writer. I wanted to introduce something from Central Africa. So I introduced the Oloko, which is from the former Zaire. And I did not make them the way that they actually are in that mythology. They're these very diminutive creatures who use these bells to call their victims, and they're cannibals. And in my book, the Oloko are sort of like the superstars of Portland, of like the magic, people. They're the most popular. They're pretty famous. So I also intentionally don't have it pluralized correctly. So Oloko should be Boloko when you pluralize it, if you're being accurate. I'm intentionally not being accurate to demonstrate that telephone effect that happens for the diaspora, which is we are told things, and then we tell things, and then we tell things, and we have an oral tradition that is our own also. And that doesn't make it inaccurate African folklore, it makes it Black American folklore. So I'm intentionally, yes, doing research, and then intentionally making changes to reflect the fact that I am Black American, and particularly that I'm Black American from the West Coast. And so I also, exactly like you said, take exception with the idea that because people aren't familiar with these things, that I'm supposed to go strictly according to what is written somewhere else, and not be able to play with it the way that I would have more freedom to play if I stuck to Western concepts and Western forms of magical creatures and fantastical creatures, and I just refuse to do that. So I'm sort of trying to get ahead of it and say, you're not going to find an error and be like, oh, this is inauthentic. This is intentional. This is an intentional error. It is meant to say something to the reader. It's meant to say something to the diaspora reading it, that we can have our own oral traditions as well. And it's not illegitimate any more than all the other oral traditions of passing down and changing traditions and mythology and folklore.
Morgan, do you want to talk about your research?
Well, after that, I mean, I just make stuff up. Yeah, I mean, I did definitely bounce off of expected tropes in fantasy, because I wanted to play with a familiar field, and then I took a few tropes and turned them on their heads. But as far as research, I remember specifically like if you research medieval torture,
as one does.
That's as one does. I mean, what day of the week is it? Monday? It's medieval torture day. I mean, that's definitely a rabbit hole where you can kind of go down it, and it's not exactly something you want to translate literally on the page, but you definitely need to have a kind of a feel of what was going on and how crimes were treated. And also another fairly distasteful was, they didn't have toilets back then. How did people deal with that? And it shows how say a peasant living in a village would deal with that compared to a prince in a his chambers. All disgusting, by the way. But again, I didn't touch on it, but you can allude to certain things just to give a little flavor. Also research, just things to make things feel authentic. But keeping in mind, I wasn't writing a medieval historical. I'm writing a high fantasy, so I took a lot of liberties with everything. Oh, another thing I had to research was travel time, because I remember, like in Game of Thrones, like the first year of Game of Thrones, like travel took months to go, 1,000 miles, and in the last season they got from the north to the south in like a day. So
that really bothered me too.
It really bothered me. It's like, oh, dragon time, it's always like flight time is like 2 hours, no problem. But I had to figure out how long it would take a horse to like go 300 miles, taking into consideration you need to eat, you need to sleep, you can't really just go straight. So that was not very interesting, but I needed it on the page. And yeah, just little things like that, just to make it feel authentic. Oh, and I ran into one thing. I think it was a copywriter who tagged me. I don't really use a lot of swear words, but I did have this one particular part where I really needed to say the word apple. One character was calling the other apple, and the copy editor said, well, this is not how they spoke in the Middle Ages. I'm like, well, this isn't the Middle Ages. This is Fallen Kingdom. So I stat that one, and I just let that one go. So and I mean, you'll get tagged for what do you call it, colloquialisms, where you use modern day language in a historical setting. But hey, I used to watch Xena, so it kind of comes to me naturally.
Yeah, distances were brutal. And I had a whole world where I didn't use like miles and stuff, and then I would fall into doing things like that, or like times of day using the clock. And I was like, oh my God, it was brutal. But for me, I did a ton of bird research, because birds. And so I got really, like, I went down a lot of bird rabbit holes. That's a mixed. I learned about birds. I learned so much I couldn't even use it all. But one of the cool things about setting it in falconry is just about every culture on Earth that has birds of prey has at some point invented falconry, but they all take different approaches to it. And so some places it's a hobby for rich people, and in some places it's a sacred thing. And so as I was taking what I wanted and needed and what was cool from all over the world, I wasn't reproducing or basing it on any one culture. I had to be careful to make sure I wasn't like frolicking in somebody's graveyard, So I had to be very mindful and do the research on what I was stealing to make sure I wasn't actually grave robbing, that I wasn't stealing something sacred for entertainment. And so that was part of the process, which just led me to lots of cool stuff that I learned that I couldn't use or didn't use. Whether it's, some of the details about sky burial in Tibetan and some of the other Himalayan cultures, or the fact that scientists do not know, and this isn't a sacred thing, this was just a thing I didn't have the chance to use. Scientists have looked into it and they do not know whether or not birds fart. It's
important info.
Yeah.
Well, now I want to know.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to apply for a grant and do research because they cannot figure it out.
Because my dog absolutely does,
And my cat, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to know why birds don't.
So, but maybe they do.
Right.
So there was a lot of that research. There was research, I'm glad you talked about the smells, just like what would it smell like if you did. I mean, these teenagers who are like falling in love with each other and stuff, they all stink.
Right.
And so I wanted to embrace that. It was also for me writing these writing explicitly queer stories. It was hearing Bethany and Shveta talk about the danger of the only one, that kind of thing where you're supposed to represent everybody that vaguely looks or sounds or talks like you. I found in YA especially, and I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I don't care. There's a certain kind, especially of gay boy, that is acceptable. And writing problem messy gays can be difficult to get appeal, since largely that's not who the audience for YA books are. And so running into writing different kinds of gay boys who maybe aren't cinnamon rolls, who may be angry, gay rage is not generally acceptable. And my gay boy hero in this is a very angry, messed up kid who makes mistakes. And writing that kind of character, it's been interesting. So I didn't necessarily do research. It's not research related, but it is world building related. I had to build a world where sexuality and gender aren't policed, and where these characters could be who they were fully, even if it's not exactly who we're as comfortable seeing. And knowing that they don't represent all queer people, they represent their specific self. And that was probably a much bigger challenge than the like bird high fantasy stuff. Running into that and knowing what I would face with that.
Especially since you said you're like, I could get in trouble for this, but especially since you could be directly challenged by the community, like writing an angry queer character, it's a different kind of, it's research that people can contest with their own personal experience, and that makes it a little more difficult.
Yeah, I never get in trouble with queer people for that. I get in trouble with straight women with that.
Sounds about right.
I don't get in a lot of trouble though. Also, my books are delightful, and you should all read them.
Yay!
I don't want to make it sound like I'm like throwing bombs here.
No, they are great books. They really are.
But Bryce, he's a mess. And the main character, one of the two main characters, he's a mess, and some people don't like seeing messy gays like that.
I think it's funny you mentioned writing an angry character, because my main character is extremely angry with the whole world in her book, because it is an unfair world for her. And the whole, I cannot tell you how many people told me she wasn't very likable. I'm like, what exactly isn't? Like, just because she's angry sometimes? And I don't know. I was an angry teenager, and I was told that I was not likable, or called a myriad of different names. And so it doesn't faze me. I'm like, whatever. And I unapologetically wrote her that way, and actually had to go back and forth with my editor a bit about it. But I think it's funny that people just don't seem to want those angry characters when it's a pretty prevalent emotion in teens, I feel. So
I mean, I think maybe that's another, as you were saying, like an illiteracy, right? Like you don't have to be best friends with the character to read them and find them compelling, maybe.
Yeah. I think for A Song Below Water, I don't, okay, so Sami, I know that you read it. I don't know if you know who so the second book isn't a sequel, but it's in the same world, and it follows a character from the first book.
Oh, the one who made me so mad.
It follows Naima, and I tweeted at some point, everybody says they're ready for an angry Black girl who doesn't get brought down a notch by circumstances or something. We'll see.
Yeah.
Because she's extremely upset. She has very good reason to be upset, and she is not the kind of Black girl who, I think that these girls, Effie and Tavia, who are the main characters of this book, might be very easy to sympathize with. But the test is like people understanding that I didn't write them for you to be okay with them. I wrote them because that's who they are. So the next girl, this is who she is, and she is not sorry. And I'm just very curious to see how people are going to respond to that, because I absolutely was like, oh, this isn't up for discussion. Like, this is the next Black girl I'm writing. And I just might make increasingly my characters angrier and angrier and angrier. And that just might be because I'm like, the thing that happens with exceptionalism is that it's like, well, we want to see, I think I've heard somebody talk about it the other day, where you'll say like Black excellence or something, and instead of that being an empowering thing for everybody, the same mainstream media that we're trying to resist against turns it into something where it's like, okay, well, that means someone who does this, and it creates a whole new stereotype that's like, that's the kind of character that we find realistic and authentic and that we want to celebrate and follow. And I'm like, okay, no, because you have to erase the entire world that we live in and our natural, acceptable responses to the world that we live in and how the world treats us and the systems of injustice that exist, even for a character. And the thing that I like about her is Naima has had it pretty good because she's a loco. And so her being mad, I feel like people are going to have a very difficult time with. But I want Black girls to be able to read stories, and you don't have to button it in all the time. You don't have to reel it in, basically, because people are saying there's a way to be sympathetic, and there's a type of Black girl main character that we're interested in seeing. I'm just, again, it's not for them. So
like I said, she made me mad, but I'm still excited because I can't wait to understand. Once I understand.
Well, here's the thing: you might not understand, and that's what I want people to be. It's like Alex was saying, like, I want people to understand that, like, even when people say like, oh, well, I like this kind of character, I like a cinnamon roll gay boy, and I really, as a straight woman, love reading cinnamon gay boys and them being my little small boys, my soft boys, and whatever, however, all the things that you see online. And you're like, there's a way that really comes across like super duper problematically and unattractively. It's a sort of like, these are not your pets. Like, we're not writing pets for you. We're actually writing for kids from that community, kids who don't see themselves in these really restrictive stereotypes and roles, and not having them have to bleed on the page for you to feel sympathy for them just because they're not super duper soft or just because they're angry or something, and just resisting. Something traumatic happens to her, obviously, but her response to it is not what people want it to be, which is like contrition and like, okay, now I see all the error of my ways. She's just more mad now. Like,
that's realistic.
Well, it's pretty natural.
Right.
She is all of us right now, though.
Like, yeah, I think maybe now people might feel a bit different about the next book since what we've all gone through here. But before Corona, I was sort of concerned with, not concerned as in I would ever change it, but I was very interested to see how people were gonna, because I think also people decided that she was the antagonist. You have to. There's 3 Black girls in the story. You can't like them all. So I feel like people sort of like decided she was the antagonist, and I'm like, well, now you're gonna read her book.
Deal with it.
Yeah.
Jess, did you want to talk about your research? We got a little off track, but I'd love to hear what you think.
So kind of what I did is, I actually, the original concept of this idea came when I saw a documentary about something called the Dyatlov Pass incident. And it's this really kind of strange occurrence that happened in Russia in the Ural Mountains, where these very experienced hikers went up into the mountains. It should have been an fairly easy hike where they're supposed to go up and then down into the next village. Well, they never came. They never arrived. So after a few days, people finally went out to go look for them, and they discovered that all their tents had been ripped open from the inside, and then all of them like scattered, and most of them were like half dressed, definitely because there was a blizzard, so they should not have been half dressed, and they were all experienced and should have known that. And then some had broken bones and such like that, but they didn't have any outward signs of these issues. I write very dark books. I guess I should have said that. And so I kind of took that concept of this weirdness, like they still don't know really what happened. And so I kind of took that concept of what if something really weird like that happened and you didn't know why, and what the fallout of the world would be like. And so that was the basis, and I did lots of research about that. And then I did a lot of research on folklore of the Slavic period, because I wanted to go even before like those countries had split apart. So they weren't Russia, they weren't Poland, they weren't any of those. I wanted even before that. So basically I had to do a lot of reading poorly scanned documents on the internet about, you know, this time period, because it's not something that a lot of people care about or learn about. And so I did a lot of that research and tried to pull the world from that kind of basis and the gods that they believed in at that time, because the gods play a really big part in my story. And so I based it off of two very old Slavic gods called Bilibog and Chernobog, and did more research on that. And so, yeah, a lot went into basing it in what would feel believable and real for people who are from that area or are children of people who are Russian and Polish immigrants, since that's important to me, since that's what my husband and my in-law family are. And yeah, that's basically where I went, down a very deep, dark Slavic hole.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, I'm a bookseller, and I always want to know what are the books that shaped you? So if y'all have a recommendation for a book or a series or an author you think that does world building great, I think now is the time to share.
J.K. Rowling.
I don't know if anyone's read The Beautiful, but that book was so good.
Oh, so good.
Oh yeah, I want to read that.
So I thought they did a good job of world building in that. And I love Sami Thomason's books. I think she does an excellent job. And that's a broad world. And then obviously, since I'm basing off Russian and folklore, I'm going to mention the Grisha trilogy. I really enjoyed those, but they're kind of an older book. So yeah, I mean, there's so many. I've read so many books recently. I loved Kingdom of Souls. That book was great.
Oh, that book is good. So
did a great job with world building.
I mean, I just said J.K. Rowling just to be funny, but when you think about it, a sign of good world building would be if you could build a theme park around your series.
Yeah.
I mean, the places people would go into and where they would eat, and where the roller coasters would be. So tongue in cheek, but there is some truth in it.
I don't think you can talk about current fantasy, YA fantasy world building without talking about The Bells by Danielle Clayton. I mean, that's I can smell it. I can see, it's super vivid. I close my eyes and it's just the bright brilliance of it.
I want a teacup elephant also. I really want a teacup.
I do too.
I want a teacup everything, just to be really honest. I don't understand why there isn't somebody. Was there somebody who just has everything? Because I want all of them. We Set the Dark on Fire, I also feel like had amazing world building. I think those are the two for YA fantasy that definitely just pulled me in immediately. And I think I judge it by, do I want to go there? And I immediately wanted to be in both places. So
I agree with all of that. I'd add, I think Holly Black, anything she's written really, she is a master of world building and building magic systems. Her Curse Workers series has like the coolest magic system
Yes,
ever.
no one loves that series enough. I'm mad.
I'm obsessed with that series. It needs to be a TV show. It needs to be, I wouldn't want to go to that theme park, but it just needs to be. But her Folk of the Air series, that world building is wonderful in every way. I also think this series, it won some awards, but I don't think it found the readership it should have. Fran Wild's Bone Universe books. just have the coolest, most rich, detailed world building that just, it made me mad. It was so good, that world building, you know, it like made me like, I had to up my game because of how what's the first one called? I'm blanking on the title. Updraft, thank you. So people should definitely check that out if they want to see just some killer world building. And then in the more sci-fi space, Tochi Onyebuchi's War Girls.
So good.
Super cool, more sci-fi-ish.
Okay.
Well, since Alex so rudely stole my answer of Holly Black, because, you know, I had written on and off my whole life, but that when I read Tithe, and that really made, and I love fairy folklore, fairy lore, that made me want to do my version of that. And so, but also beyond her, I would say Laini Taylor, because again, she makes the world, even if you can poke some holes in it later and realize, you know, like the feeling of it is so rich that I would want to go there. And then also Anna Marie McLemore, their stuff is just so rich and like eating a fine dessert. And so, yes.
Y'all, I will have excellent taste. Just as a professional, I can let you know that you've got it down. So we have time for one more question. And because we're all at home, what are you reading right now?
Oh God.
Television?
Yes, I'm reading a lot of television. Yeah.
I have a 19-month-old, so you know it's a lot of picture books and sleeping when I can. I'm brain dead by the end of the day. I just finished judging a middle grade book award last year, so I read like 300 middle grade novels. So I'm really all about reading grown-up books right now. Things where people curse and have grown-up problems, and so
have you read Riot Baby?
I haven't read Riot Baby yet. It's in my pile.
Do it.
I just read Anne Patchett's The Dutch House, which was fine. It was lovely. I like wanted to go to the opposite. You know, I've been reading nothing but like speculative fiction for a while also, so I wanted to go the opposite way. So like a quiet literary novel was like the opposite. But mostly I'm just watching Netflix.
Yeah.
I'm reading
go ahead.
I'm reading Ninth House.
Yes.
Bardugo. Yeah, I've just started it. So
you're gonna have nightmares for weeks.
Oh, good. Yeah, awesome. I should have got an ebook. It's so heavy. Like the actual hardcover is so heavy.
The tome.
So I might grab the ebook on that.
Okay.
I'm listening to Shannon McGuire's Middle Game.
Oh, yes. Yes, audiobooks are also an excellent use of your time.
I'm listening on audiobook to Marie Lu's Kingdom of Back right now, and then I'm reading The Devouring Gray and what is it? Oh, A Curse So Dark and Lonely. I read lots of books at once, so.
I just finished watching Unorthodox on Netflix. So I adored it. It was only 4. I didn't know it was going to only be 4 episodes. It's a limited series, but I loved it. I would be very interested, of course, to hear from which of course I won't, but to hear from the community that's you know being spoken of so freely, because obviously they will likely feel quite different. It was beautifully done, I will say.
I'm actually reading The Star Daughter right now. Surprise! I'm enjoying it a lot. And speaking of world building, I just finished Ashley Poston's Among the Beast and Briars. Y'all get ready. It's like that Diana Wynne Jones book that I've been wanting for my soul since Diana Wynne Jones passed. Ashley's got it. Like, we're good to go.
I'm Jessica Rubinkowski. My debut novel is The Bright and the Pale, and you can find me on Twitter at Jess Rubinkowski, because Jessica Rubinkowski is way too long. So, and that's on everything, Instagram too. Like, it's just what I use. So.
I'm Bethany C Morrow. I wrote A Song Below Water, which comes out June 2nd, 2020, and I am at BC Morrow on Twitter and Instagram. If you go to the Instagram, you will be disappointed. Probably just stick to Twitter. I don't understand how I'm supposed to be using Instagram, so I just post stuff I want to post, and then people largely don't care.
I love Instagram. I'm Morgan Rhodes, author of the Falling Kingdoms finished 6-book high fantasy series with Razorbill. You can find me at morganrhodes.net and on Instagram and Twitter, Morgan Rhodes YA, all one word.
I'm Alex London, Black Wings Beating, Red Skies Falling, the latest ones. Social media is killing all of us. I'm on all of it, but I'm not going to shout it out. Find me, I'm Googleable, but no.
And I'm Shveta Thakrar, and I will actually spell my name for you. I'm on Twitter and Instagram, both at SHVETATHAKRAR. And my debut novel, Star Daughter, which is about a half human, half star girl who has to go win a celestial competition to save her dad's life after she accidentally burns him with her starry flame, will be out on August 11th, 2020.
And can I just say, I'm at Sami Says Read. Please buy from an independent bookstore. We need your help. And we all ship.
Oh, I didn't know they all shipped.
Sami, what's your bookstore?
My bookstore is Square Books. We're in Oxford, Mississippi. We are doing half price shipping. So also, you can buy books from me. Just holler at me. I'll pick you out something. I'm around.
That's my favorite ship.
Yes, we do ship.
Get it?
I got it though.
I got it.
Sorry, I apologize.
No,
You're a dad. You're a dad. You can do dad jokes. It's
Yes,
fine.
it's fine.
Very true.